I grew up in Hyderabad. Hyderabad meaning actually in a cantonment town. There used to be the Sikenderabad Cantonment, which is a part of Hyderabad city. And my father was a still photographer. So that explains the family interest in photography and film and so on. And we used to have a little cinema, an army cinema. It was called the Garrison Cinema. And there used to be 3 changes a week in that cinema. And mostly the films that were shown were American and British films there. Sundays you might have had one Hindi film. So ever since I remember, ever since I was a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I remember seeing films there, as many as 3 a week, 4 a week sometimes. And so I grew up on all these films, Warner Brothers films. I knew a lot of directors at that time. Their work, for instance, I knew the work of William Dieterle, directors of that kind, William Wyler. Houston was already a name that I started to become familiar with. So, and nobody seriously objected to my seeing films. The only objection was spending money on films. That was the real problem. And in order not to spend too much money, my brother and I had worked out a couple of devices. One was to create a kind of, one side of the cinema, there was nobody there. There used to be tennis courts. So we'd put a wedge in the door. So without paying any money, we could watch a lot of films from there, which we did. Then made friends with these operators, projectionists. And that way saw a large number of films, where we also got cuttings, of various films and so on. And we used to have a little magic lantern. And we used to construct our own little films, my brother and I. So interest in film was sort of constant from the very beginning. And then too, there was a cousin now, Gurudat, for instance. Gurudat was coming into films in those days. He was with Uday Shankar in Almora, and after that, when he came to Bombay, he got into films. He was with Prabhat as dance director, and later on as assistant director, and then moved to Bombay. Now, his career was a kind of inspiration. I would sort of very keenly listen to what he was doing whenever there was talk about Gurudat, and when he did come on holidays and things like that, my curiosity knew no end, So that was how I think I was fired by this idea of wanting to become a filmmaker. Then I also had a brother in Calcutta, my eldest brother. He was a painter, an artist, but a great cineast. And he used to subscribe to the Penguin Film Review. And the Penguin Film Reviews used to come regularly in those days. And as soon as he read them, he would post them to us. So I had the whole set of a Penguin Film Review, which was my serious reading of the cinema while growing up. Oh yes, there were a lot of films. For instance, I'll give, you see, we used to, I think as a family, we used to see about 2 films a month, 2 or 3 films a month. The whole family would go. And the special favorites for my parents were Prabhat films. Films made by Prabhat were favorites. Nobody ever missed them. Every new film that came out of Prabhat would be seen by the entire family. That was one. Every film that came out of Mehboob Studios also used to be seen. Then new theatres. These were the 3 basic studio-made films that we used to see as a family. So obviously, that had a great amount of impression. I remember, apart from those 3 studios, I myself used to see a lot of other films also, like Ranjit Studios films, Sagar, Movietone, all those films. Motilal used to be a favorite actor also. So all, I mean, it was fairly wide, the viewing of movies, including Wadia movie-tone films, all the stunt films and so on. But I got off those stunt films rather quickly because the effects and the stunts in American films used to be much more real looking, you know, and the effects were better, the technology was better, the techniques were better, all that sort of thing. So, yes, you might say that it was the influence largely of cinema from outside. Although I would say that Prabhat's two films of Prabhat, Ram Shastri, which I continue to enjoy, which I watched even last week when it came on Doordarshan, and the other film that had tremendous amount of impact was Sant Tukaram. Now these Prabhat films have been my perennial favorites. I keep watching them all the time. In terms of other films, I used to find New Theatres films a bit theatrical myself, even then. But the subject matter of those films used to be very good. You know, I mean, they were serious subjects. They were socially involved subjects and stories and so on. Then, what else? I can't.
When did you actually? I mean, all this was inspiration for films. But when did you first really toy the idea of becoming a filmmaker yourself, not just somebody who enjoyed films, but somebody you wanted to express with film as a medium?
From the very beginning. There never was any doubt in my mind about what I was going to be doing. It was just a question of how. Because living in Hyderabad is not the easiest place to imagine you want to become a filmmaker, you know, because it's more like a dream. In those days in Hyderabad, there was nothing. There was no film industry close by. The film industry was either in Bombay, Pune, or in Madras. So that was the only thing. It was how does one go about becoming a filmmaker. The problem was not whether I had decided or not. I'd already decided.
And as a child, did you make a film? Did you familiarize yourself with the camera or?
Yes, no. One of the favorite things used to be to, you know, those flip books. I used to make a large number of these flip books with actions, you know, drawn action. But I'd done a whole thing based on, you know, when I was a kid, we used to get a lot of these flip books on how to play tennis, how to play cricket, all these things. And so based on that, because I had a big collection of those how to play series, you know, of different kinds, like Donald Bradman, you know, making a cover drive. That was a little book which you flipped and you saw the action. So you used to make these drawings. All kinds of actions, you know, stunts and various things. So that was the basic training, I think, of how to set how to stage a scene. So I'd made many flip books. In fact, all my copybooks, my class copybooks, at the edges, I used to use them as flip books and make drawings, you know, of different things, chaps laughing, crying, you know, tears falling down, all that sort of thing. So I think that's how one really learned how to see action, you know, in movement.
You were telling me yesterday that, you know, at the age of 12, you sort of tried your hand in actual filmmaking with the 16.
Only once. That was because, you see, the camera was available. There was a Payard Bullocks camera. It was new, a motorized camera which my father had bought for himself, actually. And so we used that camera to make a little film called Chuttiyon Mein Mauj Maza.
You still have that film?
Yes, it should be there. I must look for it. I promised myself this thing and I've never been able to do it. But I will now. I think I should get myself the print of that film.
When was the first, or which was the first film that you did actually independently?
The very first film I did independently was a documentary called, what was it called now? It was on the Mahi Sagar Dam. It was a documentary which I made. It was called Gher Betha Ganga. The commentary was in Gujarati. It was made for the Gujarat government, actually. That was the first absolutely independent film. Of course, I was making advertising films. But then advertising films it's a complicated way of doing them, or at least it was at that time. You hired a producer from the agency, you wrote the script, you maybe directed, but the responsibility of the production was entirely on the producer. But that was a great help because one could make a large number of films, because I remember I made hundreds of films when I was in advertising, hundreds of them. And it was day to day, every day there was a new film to make, and all kind, and writing of scripts and so on. That was the main disciplining factor. That's how I learned the disciplines of writing, of staging scenes, working out how to shoot a film, breaking it all down, and all the rudiments of editing, recording, mixing, all that sort of thing. Well, you see, the needs are different. Like when you're making a feature film for the cinema, you're making a cinema film, let's say, for an audience who's going to pay to see the film, or the kind of subject that you take. Advertising films are largely based on effects. You want to get a particular kind of effect. The method is persuasion and manipulation. And the eventual end is an effect that you want. So this is quite different from doing another kind of film. But the techniques are basically the same. I mean, once you learn the technique, then it's a question of how you're going to use that technique. To say that if you were making advertising films, that you will later on be unable to make anything else, I think is very silly, because the ends are different. Here there's a concept of self-expression and so many other things, while in advertising you are gearing it to sell a product or a service, and you're working on the basis of effects and ideas that relate specifically to selling. But here you are relating it to either telling a story or creating one or another kind of an impact, or provide an insight of some kind. The ends are completely different, one from the other. So I don't see why this confusion exists in people's minds, that if you started by making advertising films, that it's going to have a certain kind of impact on everything. No, but I would say that if you do advertising films, and if you've been quite diligent about it, I'm quite sure it's a wonderful area to learn the disciplines of making films. And also, there's also a stress on finishing things well. A lot of people think this is too much of polish and too much of this, that, and the other. But then, on the other hand, you can't really have tackiness in your work. Yes, I understand that there is something like doing something cosmetically, for cosmetic finish. But when you are aware of it, then you won't go for a cosmetic finish.
I have gone ahead a little. Let's go back a little. When did you really come to Bombay?
I came to Bombay more or less soon after I finished my college. I did an MA in economics, and I wasn't sure whether I would be able to get into films. Then there were a couple of my friends who suggested that I might get work in advertising, more as a copywriter, more than anything else. And so I came because I had to make a living. So I came to Bombay because all the advertising agencies were in Bombay. The film industry was located in Bombay. And I found a job quite easily as a copywriter. And I continued to write copy for a while. And then after my first change of job, when I went into a much bigger agency where there was a proper film department and they were making advertising films, in fact the management itself felt that I would be better there, even before I could say it. So I went from copy immediately into films.
You never sort of thought that you'd use, Guru Dutt or connections, family connections with him to sort of...
No, because I wasn't in total agreement with the kind of films that were being made. I also felt that, by this time Satyajit Ray had already made a few of his films. I was very, very impressed with those, Satyajit films. There was Hrithik had made one film by then. I was very much more, I felt that the way I was thinking about film was much closer to those kind of films rather than films that were being made in Bombay. Although I did work on a couple of scripts for Gurudat. He once asked me if I would like to work for him. I didn't think it was the right kind of thing to do because I felt that I didn't want to get too oriented into thinking about film in those terms, because then I'd never be able to break away from it.
This period of time where you were sort of thinking of making films and you were being influenced by some of the films by Ray and Ritik Hatta, what was the political sort of milieu like? I mean, in Hyderabad, for instance, was it the time of Telangana movement and uprising, or was it before that or after?
It was, the Telangana movement came much earlier. That was part of my growing up, and it had a tremendous amount of impact. And I had a lot of people I knew who had participated. And when I went into college, some of these people were released from jail, They were, many of them were jailed and so on. They were released from jail, and some became my classmates, as a matter of fact. And they were part of my peer group, So they had a tremendous amount of influence on me, particularly in the way I thought about the world, about the way things were moving, about society, Indian society, and so on and so forth. So that had a tremendous amount of impact, and that impact hasn't really gone yet. Whether I like it or not, I continue to look at the world in a particular way, where I can see, it in social terms, in terms of exploitation or oppression and so on and so forth. That has never really left me, because it was part of my growing up. It happened during the most impressionable years of my life. And these were happenings around me at that time,
Now, before I come to Ankur, which was really your first feature film, was that the first script that you wrote also for as a feature film?
Yes, I wrote that in fact, I wrote that as a short story. Ankur was written as a short story when I was still in college. Then I worked on it for a script. I worked on it many, many times. I made many, many drafts. Eventually, the draft I made for the film was very different from the very first draft I'd written as a screenplay. But it was also one of the ways I learned how to write a screenplay, because with Ankur itself, when I started to convert it, I had read this book, Technique of Film Editing, Carol Rye's, which is like the Bible. And based on that, and particularly, I remember Carol Rye's had done a great deal, had worked in some detail with some of Lean's films, like Great Expectations and Oliver Twist and so on. So that was really one of the ways of learning. And so that's how I started to work out scripts and break down shots and so on. But much of this was very theoretical, of course. It became more practical once I started to actually make films. Then one could see that you can't really learn to write a script in theory. You have to be working with films before you actually attempt to write scripts.
And what was this time space, between the time when you sort of conceived Ankur and it really became your first film? I mean, how many years elapsed? How many years was that project?
Oh, many, many years. But when I did, when I had the script when I came to Bombay, so it took me roughly from then 14 years before I made the film. But seriously speaking, it took 12 years, because I would go from producer to producer, finding out if I could make this film for them. Of course, nobody, everybody thought that it was ridiculous that I should even think of making a film like this, because there was no conventional hero, there was no conventional heroine, there were a whole lot of selfish people about, who I was supposed to get the audience to identify with, all this kind of thing. So it was very difficult until around 1971 or 72, I think, when Mohan Bijlani, Lalit Bijlani's father, Blaze, he and his partner, Freni Varyava, they said, well, you make this film for us. And so I took a rain check from them on that, and I was on a fellowship at that time. So 2 years later, when my fellowship ended, I made the film.